that time is going to go by very, very quickly and coming up in every way. Let me move on into what I wanted to talk about here. This is a Bible study type service and subject that I want to give, and really kind of a reminder type subject to a lot of us as we come into this season. Are you ready for Christmas? You're laughing. You're not ready, are you? Well, I get a haircut once a month. And I always try to make it as close to the first week of December. I don't want to wait till I get close to Christmas, because I go to the same lady in the salon there. I don't go to a barber because they butcher you, but I go to, the scissor cut is much better. Unless you want a real good close shave around the ears, you go to a barber. I learned all about that when I grew up. But anyhow, the lady who I go to every year, I'm scheduled to go in Monday morning and get my December haircut. And I'll tell you what she's going to say. Are you ready for Christmas? Every year. Are you ready for? Yeah, you know, I can answer that two ways, and it's exactly correct and true. Yes, I am, and no, I'm not. I haven't decided this year which one to say. Then you try to, of course, move the conversation on a little bit, you know, and something else, think of something else to talk a little bit about and get off at the subject. A lot of people are very big and into Christmas. When I went to Sam's Club, which is right near where we live, Labor Day weekend this year, all the Christmas decorations were up. We hadn't even got anywhere close to Halloween, let alone Thanksgiving or Christmas. And yet it was all up. It's been all up since that time. Everywhere we go, my wife and I go out for lunch, music everywhere being played, and in the restaurants. So it is obviously something that we all have to face every year. And I look around here, you are all veterans, of course, of having to come up with the answers or whatever. How well do you know the reason why we do not keep these particular customs? Well, I know you know a lot of it, but I would like to center here scripturally today. I believe that's the best way. I will look at some of the history here, but you know, it's interesting about some of the history. In our booklet that goes back to 1952 in the church, The Plain Truth About Christmas. And we did a pretty good job, I thought. I went back and looked at it yesterday. Encyclopedia Britannica, Encyclopedia Americana, Shaft Herzog, Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. We were doing a lot of very interesting quoting back then. And we also quoted this book, 4,000 Years of Christmas. Now, this is the updated version. The original publication of this book was 1948, and by Earl Count and his wife Alice. Now, Earl Count is interesting because he's now deceased, of course, but this was republished in 1997. He was an Episcopalian minister. And some of the things I'll read to you before I go on into some of the scriptures that I think are very interesting. I don't want to bring encyclopedias up here and get too many of these things. It might be too much. But you can go on your computer and under Google search, just type in a question or whatever, and you get all kinds of stuff will come up if you want to get into it even a little bit more. And if any of you want to see this book, which we quoted years and years ago when it first came out in 1948, just go to Amazon. It's on there, 4,000 Years of Christmas. It comes right up, and you can, if you want it. It's a very easy reading, and it's not a lot of documentation type thing. It goes back to Babylon 2,000 years before the coming of Christ. And many of the celebrations we have today were done at that time for the sun god. And then in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Catholic Church, as it was growing, began to adopt some of the Christmas things. Well, I'll read just a quick review of those, and then I'd like to look at some of the scriptures here as we go along. Mr. Cowd writes that what the land of Eden and its waters were to all the earth, the land of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers has been to our own way of life. Mesopotamia is the very ancient mother of civilization. Christmas began there over 4,000 years ago as the festival that renewed the world for another year. The 12 days of Christmas, the bright fires, and probably the Yule log, the giving of presents, the carnivals with their floats, their merrymakings and clownings, the murmurers who sing and play from house to house, the feasting, the church processions with their lights and song, all these more began there centuries before Christ was born, and they celebrated the arrival of a new year. That's kind of interesting, easy reading. One other one I wanted to just pass on here, I thought was an interesting quote. This chapter begins with this title, A Mother and Child in Quest for a Birthday. When was Jesus born? I had a conversation with my sister back in 1965 when I sent her a letter that I wasn't going to be keeping Christmas anymore. She's quite a bit older than I was, and I was a student in college at Portland State College as it was then. And, well, Jim, when you get through your classes in the morning, come on over, we'll have lunch and talk about this. And surprising to me, she said, well, we know, she was LDS or Mormon, we know that Christ was not born on December 25th. And we know that we think it was probably in the springtime. And of course, we believe it's in the fall, but we don't know what date in the fall. She went on to say to me, but you know, we believe we need to do something for Christ. And I thought I better keep my mouth shut. Yes, we do. And be wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. And my thoughts, of course, were, well, why don't we obey him? Sermonette there, obedience. And because if we wanted to, and we should do something for Christ. And that's what we should do. Well, when was Jesus born? No one knows. December 25th is no more the historical date of his birth than is any other. The Christians chose it to be the birthday only several centuries after he had lived and died. The earliest Christians were not interested in Jesus' birthday, but by the 4th century, they had become very much interested. How this came about is the story of a soil growing. Christmas is a seed that sprouted in that soil. It sprouted when the Christians at last turned their eyes upon Jesus, the infant, and his mother Mary. There never would have been a Christmas as we know it without the Madonna and the child. Very open, very honest. The author, he and his wife here, are very open about the whole thing. But it's okay. It's okay. Christ has done everything for us, right? So all we have to do is put his name on it and continue those things. I could read, I have one other source, but I probably will just skip over it here, The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. Again, says the same thing that Earl Count has to say. But here you have a minister openly admitting all of these things and where it came from as far as a historical point. A number of years ago, when we were in United Church of God, I, as a pastor, was asked to answer letters because we didn't have enough people in Cincinnati at that time to be able to keep up the volume of answering letters. We've done that in Cagua as well. But I enjoyed it for a while. It took up a lot of time because you want to try to really be careful and make sure you're answering it and not just whip it out real fast to the question. I had this individual one time write who had read some of our literature and realized we did not believe in keeping Christmas. And that Christ, but he wanted to argue that he and whoever else besides him, we keep it because we keep his birthday. And he wanted to cite Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 14. I'll just tell you what it says there, but actually there's more information on the same subject in Matthew's account, Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. What it is the angels coming to the shepherds in the field and to tell them of good tidings and everything, that the Christ is being born in Bethlehem. And of course, they then came there to see for themselves. He felt that that was a birthday celebration, and that celebrating his birth, because, well, maybe I should read it real quickly here. I do have it. Verse 13, and suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth praise, goodwill toward men." Well, see, it's almost like singing happy birthday, beginning that. No, I wrote back and explained why, of course, we do not keep Christmas, and cited some of the things we'll review here today, which you know, but you probably haven't looked at it for a year or so. And but we at least should have in our mind as to why we do not. All that upset him. And he wrote back to me again, and I thought, well, let me reiterate. You failed to look at the things I mentioned in the previous answer to your question, and this is simply the facts. But he didn't like the facts. And I guess there's probably a lot of people that would not like to hear that and or read it. And so we have to obviously have a little wisdom in what we say and who we say it to. But it was interesting when you run into this and you see it on television, you watch certainly the news shows and all of that. The theme is on as we get into the month here of December. Let's look now, what does the Bible have to say about this? Some of this will be reviewed to you. What does it have to say about adopting pagan customs and idolatry into the true worship of God? Are Christians supposed to do that? Many do, and they don't seem to think that there's anything wrong with it, and they seem to be sincere, but that's not what the Bible teaches. Let's go back here and begin with Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy 12, instruction to the Israelites coming out of the desert into the promised land, and this is what Moses was inspired to write, and of course from God. In chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, verse 29, then the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations which you go to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their land. Now take heed, verse 30, to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, well, how did these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. In verse 31, you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination of the Lord, which he hates, they have done to their gods, or they even burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it. Now, you would think that should be enough right there, that nothing more needs to be said. But that really is not the case at all, as we know, and we look down through the years, even in the Old Testament. If you look during the period of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, what were they doing? When a righteous king did come along, Hezekiah, Josiah, what did they have to remove? Well, first of all, they on board the doors locking up the temple to once again have the temple service, but they had, what else? Up on the Mount of Olives, you had the high places for pagan worship. What were they doing up there? Didn't it say right here? You don't do these things. The Jebusites, the Canaanites, what do you got their gods up there for, overseeing the city down here and the temple? And that seemed to have been there all through that period. Yes, even the Jewish kings and had all of this, and they allowed, the people wanted it, and they allowed it to stay there, whether they believed it or not. Now, going forward here in the Old Testament, let's go to Joshua 23, as they are in the Promised Land. And so Joshua said in chapter 23 of his book, verse 6 through 8, now, these scriptures can be helpful to you. This is not obviously something you're going to tell somebody who asks you why you don't keep Christmas. I mean, but you ought to know a little bit. That reminds me, if I can digress, when I was about 17 years old, and I had read the church's booklet on the plain truth about, I was convinced I needed to change it. Well, Christmas was a big deal in our house. My married sister and her family, it was a big deal. She told me how that they set aside over $400 in the summertime working so they'd have plenty of money for gifts at Christmas time. Well, back in 1963, $400 was a lot of money, and much more than it is today. I remembered that because 400 money. You actually said, "You're kidding me, do you?" And anyhow. So it was a big thing. It was, we had the trees up. We had the decorations, the lights out on the house. My dad put it all up and everything. And, of course, as a kid, I was really into it until I read the booklet. And I was, of course, beginning to take the Bible correspondence course at the time. And I don't know how far along I was, but I knew these things were true as I read them and looked at it. So for some reason, I got in touch with the correspondence department in Pasadena. How should I go about this? I had gone to the Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon, the same one Herbert Armstrong went to prove that his wife was way off in space on the Sabbath, and spent 6 months there. Well, I didn't spend 6 months, but anyhow, I had done some research and had it all planned, a documented letter with everything I was going to send to my brother and his family, to my sister and her family. And I'm glad I did ask about that. I quickly got a response. Don't do it. No, you want to just write something that will be shorter and to the point, and not go all into this long explanation and everything. It'd probably just only make people a little angry. So I did, and that's why my sister then, when she got my letter, which was a short letter, less than 1 page, and invited me over to discuss it. We had a good discussion, by the way. Ended very, very friendly. We always have been, and she accepted my belief and everything, and I never was critical of hers. I just wanted to have peace and all of that, which we did. But here, Joshua 23, verse 6 through 8, therefore, be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. And lest you go among these nations, these who remain among you, you shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them, and you shall not serve them, nor bow down to them, but you shall hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. And yes, that is very much in force today. When we understand and see these things and realize what the truth is, yes, we hold fast, we worship God, we do not compromise and try to bring in order to have peace and all of that. Now, I've been visiting an individual off and on who this is a problem, because his wife is very much into Christmas, whereas he knows and understands, but he's trying to reason every way that to do both. to serve God and to please her. There comes a point where, I'm ahead of myself, I guess, because I'll come back to this later here as we go into this today. Yes, we do want to try to do everything to be able to not please, well, to get along, you might say. But there comes a point, and I'll come back to this later, where one mate, in this case, the husband, is going to have to finally decide, well, which way is it going to be? I can't have both. And but hopefully that will come along here. It's been a couple years for this man. All right, coming back here, going on, let's look at Jeremiah chapter 10. Joshua is making it plain, just as Moses did. Joshua continued everything. Then we come up to the period 400 years later, to the period of Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 10, in worldwide, we were being told that, not just us, but others at times had speculated whether Jeremiah 10 is talking about Christmas trees in prophecy. Well, not specifically. And it is more specifically talking about the trees in that age of time that they would have been familiar with. But when you look at this, yes, it doesn't mean only specifically for that age and time, but for any down through the ages where such a thing is used. And I would come back and say, yes, that would include today's Christmas tree. Now let's look at it here, and I'll explain why. In Jeremiah chapter 10, we'll start in verse 1. Hear the word which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. If you look up the origin of Christmas trees, you can just go on your computer, Wikipedia, or any place can give you some answers. Very interesting, the background in. And what you're going to find out right away is, where did the Christmas tree come from and the celebration of all of this? From learning of the ways of the Gentiles, of their paganism and pagan worship. That's what it was for, because it's evergreen. It doesn't lose leaves. It doesn't have leaves. And it was a natural thing that they would use for their worship, especially at this time of year. In Europe, Germany, and particularly now, remember when I say Germany, it wasn't Germany as it is today. You had German city-states and so forth. It was not united. It goes way back. But they were, a lot of it was from the Germanic people. And others of Eastern Europe too. Now, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven. Don't be scared. Don't be frightened. And, people today, the astrology, they look for these signs, and sometimes they'll be fearful for what they think the sign means. For the Gentiles are dismayed at them, but the customs of the people are futile. For one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. Now, I know that sometimes this was pictured as almost like a totem pole in Egypt or something, but have you ever seen a forest in Egypt? I don't know even anciently of a forest. It says, who cuts the tree down, the forest here. What forest? There were some forests in Lebanon and northern Israel. I think even today there are some. They tried to replant a lot of it that's been destroyed. That is Jewish state has. But coming back here, for the custom of the peoples are futile, for one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They decorate it with silver and gold, and they fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. They are upright like a palm tree, but not necessarily a palm tree, like a palm tree that is upright. And and they cannot speak, they must be carried, because they cannot go by themselves. And do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor can they do any good. Now, we were told years ago that was really not, we can't say that that had anything to do with today's Christmas tree. I disagree with that. Yes, it is true. At that time specifically, it was referring to an upright tree or pole fastened so it would be upright. But this is prophecy. And it's not just talking only about that time in the southern kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem, but also it would apply to any of those who want to serve God and think that they are through the ages. Why would it only be applied in 600 BC? And if it's being practiced, maybe in a slightly different form, 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, it would still apply. It would still apply. Well, we are, as it says here, we're commanded not to learn or practice the pagan customs of the Gentiles. And people, a lot of people understand, and certainly Earl Count is very, very open about where the Christmas tree came from, and yet seems to think there's nothing wrong. Well, we just adopt all the ways of. Did you not read the Bible, Earl? About starting in the Old Testament. And how do you justify this type of thing? And yet they think it's so wonderful. It goes way back to Babylon 4,000 years ago. Well, what are you doing it for? Jesus Christ, how many Christmases did he keep? How about his disciples? This guy who wrote to me years ago now, I pointed out to him there is no Christmas in the New Testament. The apostles, can you find any place in the epistles where the apostles ever made any mention of the birthday of Christ? What a slap in the face. It's not there. Oh, that irritated him. And he was telling me, well, if that's, you're in danger of, you know what, and all of that, because he could not answer. And I was being very polite. Going on here, I read to you in those brief paragraphs in the 4,000 Years of Christmas. One of the things I read was that gift giving. Even Ezekiel here, chapter 20, talks about that. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 39. Once again, Ezekiel is warning, in this case, I think particularly Judah. He was one of the earlier captives taken to Babylon. And of course, then he wrote a number of the prophecies that were really meant for Israel that had already gone into captivity. But some of it for also Judah. And here in chapter 20 and in verse 39, I will purge the rebels from among you, he says, and those who transgress against me, I will bring them out of the country where they dwell, and they shall not enter the land of Israel. And I have right here, I'm reading verse 38. Verse 39, and as for you, O house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, go serve every one of you his idols, and hereafter, if you will not obey me, but profane my holy name, no more with your gifts and your idols. And that was a part of it. And it's interesting, I read that, you may have caught it or not have caught it, but I did read it here, that where all of this came from. Very interesting. Now I know you know that. It's good to review it. I think, especially this time of year and at the beginning of this month, you're going to have a lot of it. You're going to hear a lot of it from now over the next 3 weeks. How about Malachi chapter 3? Now we've been looking here in the Old Testament. We're going to go to the New. But even here in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, for I am the Lord, I do not change. Therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob. I do not change. I think Mr. Counts thinks that God changed or that Jesus Christ changed. We can do both now. No, we should not. If we truly want to worship God, we should not. All right. Does the New Testament free us from the Old Testament so people can celebrate Christ's birth as they wish. Did Christ come to free us? I think I spoke on that on a sermon here a few weeks back. Did Christ end the law? Did he fulfill it for us so that we can do as we please? That's very popular, by the way, and it is. People are sincere in believing that. And one day I hope and pray that their minds will be opened up from that kind of blindness. Mine was, yours was, right, at one point in time. Well, here in the book of Mark, let's start looking in now to the New Testament. Mark chapter 7. Mark 7, verse 6 and 7. Jesus said, in vain you worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of the pitchers and cups and many other such things you do. These were their customs of that day in the Jewish community. Verse 9, so he said to them, all too well, you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. And people, I don't think they realize it, maybe some do. I think some ministers do. The commandment of God is still in effect today, Deuteronomy chapter 12, and certainly what Joshua told them. All of it is still in effect today when you understand what it is. Are the 10 Commandments done away with? Is the first commandment and the second commandment, well, we just tear it out of the Bible. It's not there anymore. I mean, Christ did it for us. No, he did not. He told the lawyer who said, what must I do to have eternal life? Well, keep the commandments. Well, which ones? All of them. All of them. He named 5 of them. He didn't have to go. The man got the point. What more must I do? And you know the story. Well, sell what you have, come follow me. Come and keep it all. Verse 13, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. Well, these are traditions. These are traditions that were accepted from the pagan worshipers of the 4th century and became then a part and just put, well, we'll change the name. We'll change the name. No, we do not follow the traditions of men when they're in conflict with the commandments of God. Now, we just kept Thanksgiving. Wonderful tradition. Is it in any way in conflict with the commandments of God? A day of national thanksgiving. And certainly Abraham Lincoln, when he proclaimed that, 1863, I believe it was, during the Civil War. And some of the things, you go back, I haven't done it in a long time, but Lincoln's address and calling for a national day of prayer and fasting is, it's not just the fact that he did it, but it is what he wrote, which is really shows you something about the mind of that man. And he truly had quite an understanding. Now, I don't think he knew all the things that we know here today and we follow, but he did have quite an understanding about God, and he recognized in that proclamation how great of a country that God had given us. Well, in 1863, it was nothing compared to what it would be 50, 100 years later as far as its physical progress and development. But I'll have to go back to it here sometime and read it. Maybe some of you haven't have looked at it. It is very eye-opening, I found. That's his proclamation of the National Day of Prayer and Fasting, 1863, during the Civil War. Read what was in that proclamation. That's what I find very, very fascinating. Let me get back here. Let's go to John chapter 4. This is one of the keys today, probably one of the most important keys of Scripture on the subject of why we would not keep it today. John 4, 23 and 24. To the woman at the well, Jesus said, but the hour is coming and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, where the Father is seeking such to worship him in spirit and in truth. How can you? I look here, Mr. Count, you must be a very deceived man. Of course, you'll come up in the judgment, but how was it? You're not worshiping in spirit and truth when you admit everything in your book that you admit and explain. And how can you say and stand before Jesus Christ, I worshiped you in spirit and in truth? No, he did not. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And truth. There is no truth in Christmas. Very, very simple. And because it is not the birth of Jesus Christ. By the way, years ago, when we lived in North Carolina, I don't know why, we were watching a PBS show from a North Carolina PBS show, not nationally. There was a woman history professor from Duke University that was being interviewed. It was before Christmas time, whatever, and it was leading up, talking about some of the history and going through the Magi and so forth coming. And she said, and Mary went into labor on December the 24th to give birth the next day, of course, to Jesus. And I think, you are a history professor at Duke University, and you would actually come on TV and say that? That is absolutely about as ignorant for a history professor that you could be. But I remember talking to my wife about it at the time. History professor at Duke University, and sit there and say that she went into labor to give birth to Jesus on December the 24th in the evening, Christmas Eve, and all that. You know, you read that scripture in Revelation 12:9, Satan has deceived the whole world. And you just, when you hear something like that, you just shake your head. How can a person with those kind of credentials do something or make a statement like that? No, we are to worship in spirit and in truth. Now, it's interesting what Jesus was talking here, because he was in Samaria. The Samaritans had been moved in there after the Israelites, the northern kingdom, was moved out by the Assyrians. And these people, over the centuries after that time, mixed idolatry with the worship of the Lord. She even claimed that Jacob was her father, and that she descended from, which was a lie. Now, Jesus forced her into telling the truth when you read the 4th chapter there, by the questions that and statements that he put to her. But this was the way they did things. It's like they did not know how to tell the truth. And this woman did not. And finally, when the question about her marriage, 5th husband and so forth, she realized, now, are you a prophet? And because he was telling her things that, and he'd never met her before, or she never met him. Anyhow, God wants us to worship in spirit and in truth. The Christmas tree, the Yule log, Santa Claus, on and on, is not true. Is absolutely not true, and originated from pagan practices. Let's go to 2 Corinthians John chapter 8 here in verse, a few pages, John 8:44. This applies to this as well. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. And when he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. And people, many times, they may be deceived, but they're telling lies about it that are not true. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul later, this would be 25, 30 years later, and he writes here, 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14 through 16. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial, or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them, and I will walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, he's not asking people to separate if they're married to somebody who doesn't believe as they do. But what it's all about is not practicing and compromising religion in any way. For what fellowship has righteousness to do with lawlessness? What was Paul talking to the Galatians about? And we'll look at that very quickly in a moment. I am afraid for you. You're going back. You're going back. We had ministers on Faculty Row in Pasadena in 1994 going back, putting up trees, lights in the front window on South Orange Grove. And you shake your head, you can't believe it. And Paul was concerned that there were people, of course, in Galatians here, but he's telling the people in Corinth, we don't compromise. We don't do these things. We stay separate. All right? They want to do that, that's up to them. Don't meet in the middle. Well, maybe I can borrow a little bit of it from them just so we can have peace. You won't have peace. It just doesn't work. With God, it's all or nothing, right? I think we all know that. Let me look at that real quickly. Galatians chapter 4. These scriptures certainly apply to the season that we're in man's world. In Galatians chapter 4 and verse 8. But then, indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods. Well, what might that be? Well, for the Galatians, it was the pagan religions of Asia Minor. And some of them were the Greek gods and so forth that had spewed over into Asia Minor over the centuries of time. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements? Now that term beggarly elements, which you'll find in the book of Colossians chapter 2, verse 20, is referring to demons. And the Greek word there, the beggarly elements, that's kind of a term used by the King James translators that doesn't give you the full meaning of what he was talking about here. Talking about the evil spirits of this world. That is literally what it's talking about when you see that. It's also mentioned up here in verse 3. We're in bondage under the elements of the world. The word elements there is referring to the spirits of this world. Well, we're not to be under that. Now, you Galatians, in verse 8, you're going back to what you came out of. And you do that, you're going to be back under the spirits of this world. And if you're going to live a lie and practice a lie. Verse 10, you observe days, months, seasons, and years. Now, Protestants basically have tried to say that, as ministers have, that it's referring to the Sabbath and annual Sabbath days of the Jews in the Old Testament. Baloney. There is no place in the Old Testament where you'll find that expression given of observing days, months, and seasons and years. But you will find that when it came to keeping the seasons of this world that came from paganism. And the seasons, the days, the months, and seasons and years, what's it referring to? It's referring to verse 8. Verse 10 is referring to verse 8, you going back to those things. Now, the Galatians were not going back to the Sabbath. They were not going back. If anything, Paul was showing them they're coming out to it. And they're going back to their old religion and their days and their months and their seasons of their old religion. And that's what it was referring to there. And many times has been misexplained to try to say that it has to do in verse 10 with the weekly. No, it does not have to do with the weekly Sabbath or the annual Sabbath days. And that expression that you see written in verse 10 by a former Pharisee, Paul, he knew and understood. And he knew very clearly there is no such expression like they'd given in the Old Testament in reference to either the weekly Sabbath or to the annual Sabbath days. He knew exactly what he was writing. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And verses 9 through 13. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. Brethren, you're here because you've received the love of the truth. We never want the love of the truth to slip away. Verse 11, and for this reason God will send them strong delusion as the love of the truth slips away, that they should believe the lie. What is the lie? I guess that you don't have to keep the commandments or that you can compromise. I'm not sure what he specifically had in mind at that point in time when he was writing this, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. But we are bound to give thanks to God always for you, brethren, beloved by the Lord, because God from the beginning chose you for salvation through sanctification, setting apart by the Spirit and belief in the truth. Belief in the truth. And that's what God wants us in this season of the year, to believe and to always believe in the truth. And then in Hebrews 13, verse 8, we have this statement, which agrees with Malachi 3, verse 6. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. When did he change? The apostles didn't note, well, let's see, Jesus changed, didn't he? No, nowhere. A couple others here going through in order in the New Testament, 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 4 and 6. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Well, that's pretty straight, isn't it? Verse 6, he who says he abides in him, in Christ, ought himself also to walk just as he walked. Did Jesus keep the winter solstice? How about the Roman soldiers in Jerusalem when Christ was in his ministry? Now we know it was called the Saturnalia by the Romans. We read nothing in the gospel about it. Jesus Christ certainly wouldn't have walked in that. And so John says we are to walk as he walked. We walk and stay clear of it. Is what it is, the answer there. 2 John, in 2 John chapter, there's only one chapter, but verse 4 through 6. Verse 4, I rejoice greatly that I have found some of your children walking in truth. Walking in truth. As we received commandment from the Father. And now I plead with you, lady. He uses the term lady referring to the church. Not as though I wrote a new commandment to you, but that which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. Verse 6, this is love, that we walk according to the commandments, and this is the commandment, that as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. Yes, that we pass over, he's referring to that commandment, the new commandment, but he also is talking about, I've got a report from you, lady, congregation, wherever it was. He uses that language because of the situation he was in that time that he lived, and more of a symbolic language because he wasn't sure who was going to read the letter. And but the point there is, I hear your children are walking in the truth. Verse 4. And finally, let's look at John, 3 John, and again, verse 2 through 4. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers, your life prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. Now, let me pause a moment. I'm not going to go through the 7 churches, but what do you see missing in some of those churches? They were compromising in the truth, weren't they? Thyatira, Pergamos. You go back, I have somewhat against you because you're not walking in the truth. And there were times when Christians strayed away down through the ages. And it's written there that in that age in particular, that you repent and return, as he said. So again, verse 4, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Walk in truth. My children, these obviously were probably areas where he raised up small congregations that they would have been probably at that period of time, at the end of the 1st century. And he is finding out a little bit about them and how they're doing, and he is very, very pleased to see that they're walking in the truth. With all of these things in mind, these are just some scriptures to help us to kind of fortify why we do what we do and what we believe in and what we follow. But with all of this in mind, how should we handle some of the problems that arise over Christmas? One principle that Jesus gave is in Matthew 10, verse 16. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And that certainly would apply during this time of year, depending on who it is you're talking with, of course. And it may be you just never know. Sometimes you have people that really, in some families, are very sensitive and just, not that you have to compromise, but you got to use a little wisdom and not just, some people can get over righteous in talking about, well, I don't keep Christmas, that's a pagan holiday. Well, you better be careful who you say that to and how you say it. You'd think common sense would tell you that. We want to, but some get in trouble and create a problem that does not have to be created. We want to try to be positive, friendly, and considerate. Wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. We do not have to be defensive about our beliefs. I mean, if it's obvious that there's no way around it, well, I do not observe Christmas. I don't keep it. The whole Jewish world doesn't. The Jehovah's Witnesses don't. How do I know that? Because when our kids went to the library to get out of the Christmas party, guess what other kids were there? The Jehovah's Witnesses kids were all there. And I'm sure there are others as well. But we just finally, we need to tell them, we don't observe it. And we just, if they want to know more why, I'll tell them, maybe give them, Christ was never born on December 25th. And to most people it's about, well, what about all the gifts? What about the children and everything? Well, have you seen the Jewish children deprived? They're doing pretty good, well educated, professional jobs. And they didn't grow up keeping Christmas. They never saw one. They never had a tree in the house. So, some of these arguments that sometimes people will have, they don't stop to realize. If you're living in Brooklyn, you wouldn't even ask the question because it's almost a complete Jewish community up there. What should we do about friends or relatives who usually give gifts? Well, we should contact them ahead of time if this is the first time of the season and politely explain that we do no longer observe Christmas. I did that. And guess what? In one sense, the first year it didn't do a whole lot of good. I was a teenager, and my sister and her family, my brother and his family, they all come to my parents' home, or where I was the youngest. And, I didn't have any gifts for them. But see, they gave me a lot. I got a lot of cards. I still do get cards from one side of the family, but they just feel they want to do it and all of that. I didn't get a lot of gifts. I did get some, I think, from my parents at that particular time. In most cases, you only need to give a brief explanation. That's what I was given by Pasadena at the time. They usually do not want to hear the whole history of Christmas, which was what I was prepared to write. I'm glad they told me not to. So if they do send gifts anyway, then what should you do? Well, usually it is out of affection and love that they're giving it to you. And they weren't doing it out of spite, but so go ahead and accept it. But returning it, in most cases, would only cause an offense. And you don't need to do that. Now, if you don't give them a gift from you to them, the problem will usually be solved in 1 year. So we want to do as much as we can in a wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove way, where we're not practicing or keeping it in any way whatsoever, and yet hopefully we're not going to cause any offense to others. Now, what should new members with children that have always had Christmas do? This used to come up more frequently, more often, when I had more people that I would be visiting and inviting to church, and they were coming for the first time, and parents would ask, how do we handle this? And what we've always taught is, sit down with them ahead of the season. Explain the truth about Christmas, maybe having a study, several studies with them as you're leading up to it in the fall of the year. I want to focus on giving gifts at other times of the year. How about like the Feast of Tabernacles? You know, what's that song Andy Williams sings? It's the greatest time of the year. He has a great voice, doesn't he? I wish he could have used it in other, he did use it in other songs too, but not. The greatest time of the year to us is what? The Feast of Tabernacles. And it's one thing that we emphasize with our kids. Christmas is 1 day. Feast of Tabernacles is 8 days, usually 10 days if you're traveling somewhere and traveling back. And we do a lot of things at the feast. A lot of times our kids are growing up, and I've seen this over the years, of course it's true in our family, and they stop attending sometime after graduation from high school or after going on their own or getting married or whatever. But then a lot of times I've noticed people come back. And I've also noticed where children go to the feast. I know we had a family over in Hawaii we know very well. Their kids came to the feast. And of course, Dad paid for it and everything. And one of them is a member, and the others, they didn't go to church once. They stayed in their room, and then they would join their family later. There is something about the feast. They want to come back to it. Now, one day, I think those the two that were not attending services, that may change, because they have to come to prove certain things to themselves. They're kind of back and forth, but they sure love the feast. And if I can still come, I want to come. And we've seen them at other feast sites, where not just because it was Hawaii this year, but other feast sites, and the same children will come. And that's fine. That was not the only situation. There are others that are much like that as well. And one of the things that of our children who have grown up in the church, they remember the feast. And it is a very, very important thing, and that's something they always seem to want to do, even if they're not attending at that point in time. Let's see, let me move on. Well, yes, and teaching your children, if they're new in the church, they're new to giving up Christmas, encourage them to read or to read to them some of our articles we've had on Christmas. By the way, you can go to Life, Hope, and Truth, and there's some very good but short articles. That's why I didn't read out of the two Babylons, because it's long. And I just read some short things here from the 4,000 Years of Christmas. But likewise, you can find a number of things from our own literature by just going on there, type in Christmas under search, and you'll find that we have a number of things about it. What about situations at school? Most of you have all gone through this, but maybe there's some that are about to. Instruct your children to be careful what they bring up in talking with other kids. You don't want them to be picked on and everything because maybe they said things that are maybe not so wise for them to be saying to the other kids. Just that you don't do it. And as parents, send a note or go in and see the teacher. My wife did that with our kids, and especially in the elementary school and all of that, where they have parties, Halloween party, Christmas party. Well, our kids, of course, got to go to the library with the Jehovah's Witnesses kids and, and skip the parties. But just to talk with them. What if your mate does not believe as you do? I mentioned earlier a situation I have in one case going on. Let's start with the wives. How about applying Ephesians? The wife is the member, the wife is the believer, the husband is not. Wives, go back and reflect on Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22 through 24, where we should first show honor and respect, as he's talking about there. But then if it gets to the point that he's not satisfied with that, I want you to participate. That's when, wives, if that's the case, it comes to Acts 5:29 for you and for anyone else. What's Acts 5:29? We are to obey God rather than man. Peter said that when he was being tried. We try in every way, but if there's finally, no, that's not good enough. I want you to participate. All right? That's where the line is drawn. I've got to obey God rather than man. And I want to try to do everything. I know you don't believe this, but I'm trying to be as honorable and polite to you. But when it comes down, if it comes down to it, this is where the line has to be drawn. You're asking me to violate my religious belief and conviction. And I can't do that. And Peter was saying the same thing in Acts 5:29. Well, let's turn it around. What if the husband is the member and the wife is not? That's a situation, actually, that I have going on. Well, the wife is insisting on having the Christmas tree, especially for the children, and everything all around it, all the packages and everything. Now, a lot of it's going to depend on how strong she is about wanting that. Now, in one case that I'm aware of, it's pretty strong. Husband needs to be kind, gentle, and understanding. She has 50% interest in the home and the family, right? According to the law. You do not force your will on her, just as you wouldn't want it to be the other way around either. Now, in most cases, wives respect their husband enough that they will not go along with his wishes. Both mates should teach their children the truth about, that is, if both are members or believers, that they should teach the truth to their children about Christmas. Now, we're in the situation where the wife, in this case, is insisting upon having it all the way, as it always had been for them. You don't have to participate. In my home, when I was growing up as a teenager, when I was the only one left at home and my brother and sister were married and out of the house and everything, just my dad, my mother, myself, we were really big until I read that booklet. And it was, packages were lined up and it was beautiful, all those colors and everything. I helped decorate that tree. I was putting those bulbs up and all of that. It was a shock to them when where did you get this? And from that you don't do that way. Look at all the churches around here. They all do this. Those kind of arguments and that type of thing. But I came to that point and made up my mind, and I was in no way wanting to argue. I didn't want to cause any trouble. I won't be participating. And it was almost like, you have to participate. I'm sorry. No, I'm just not going to do that. And so I was somewhat ostracized for a while there. And but they came to, when they saw I meant it and that I was going to carry through, we all got along and everything. And that for a couple of years, I think, before I went to Ambassador College, how many years was that? 3 years, something like that, before I applied and transferred to Big Sandy. And then I never was in the house again, because once I graduated, we got married and all of that. But anyhow, let me finish up here. What about Christmas at work? This comes up a lot of times. How about that Christmas party? Some of you probably have one coming up here soon. And what about that Christmas bonus coming along? Hey, now we're talking here. We got some money on the table here, right? Well, should you accept that bonus given to you at the Christmas party? If you come. Well, I've been in that before, by the way. Back in 1990, let's see, what was it, 98 through 2000, I was half-time in the church. And so I had a job as a right-of-way agent. I got my real estate license and everything and was doing that. I was doing both because in United at that time, because of the financial situation they had. And we had a real nice group of people we worked with, by the way. And of course, the company had the Christmas dinner, is what it was, in December sometime. And it really was not a problem, and it, in most cases, will not be a problem for any of you. You've already gone through all of that. The answer to the first question, should you accept the bonus? Yes! And, why? Well, because most companies hold back their bonus for the year until that time. It's not for Christmas, it's for the year of work that you've just received. They simply tack that name on it. Well, some do and some don't. And as long as you're not having to get involved in giving Christmas gifts at the party. The one time I went to that, my wife and I did, and had a great steak dinner, by the way. There was no singing of caroling, and we made that clear ahead of time. No gift giving, no singing. It was simply what the company wanted to do. It was their way of wanting to, I guess, show appreciation for your work for the year, to give you a bonus. Well, actually, I didn't get a bonus that year, but I did get paid. No, I don't recall them actually giving me a bonus. What it was actually giving us a dinner just something that, well, all companies do. And there was nothing really Christmas at all about it. It was using, what was it, a room at a restaurant, you know, a spare room or whatever that they had set it up for there to have that dinner. It's interesting, there were a number of people there who did not keep Christmas, and it was known, and I was one of them. And so my immediate boss also did not. And of course, he was a church member at that time. And so it worked out very well. But in most cases, you don't have to worry about it. People are not going to, if it's just a dinner, enjoy it. It might be a pretty good meal. And my wife and I enjoyed a good dinner that night. And actually, the people we worked with were very, very nice people. And had very good conversation. And it went very, very well. You wouldn't, unless somebody said, well, you know, they're doing it in December every year for the Christmas, you wouldn't have known it. It could have been a dinner at any other time of the year. It wouldn't have been any different. Well, what about the decorations for the company? Well, in most cases today, the company hires people to come in. You know, my nephew, he's about 10 years younger than I am from my sister. That's what he does out in Portland, Oregon. He puts up the Christmas decoration. He's hired to do that. He has his own company. And I bring that up because a lot of times this question, well, what about putting up the Christmas decoration? How many companies have employees do it? Now, sometimes they have some of the ladies in the office will decorate around in the front there, but I mean, put up the real big stuff. My nephew comes in with his company to put them up, and for the city of Portland on the streets, up over the street lights and everything. He's up there on a bucket up there, putting up all this stuff. And then he has to come down afterwards when it's over to take it all down. That's his job. But I don't think that's something that any of us have to be concerned about. Well, let me wrap this up here because one last thing, and this is one that you run into all the time. What should you do when you are wished Merry Christmas? Hide? No. Well, don't wish Merry Christmas in return. Just simply say thank you for the sentiment that they're expressing at that time of year, and let it go with that. Now, it's fun in doing that because you look at the expression in the eye when they don't get a Merry Christmas in return. And he just said thank you, and all of that. Well, that might help a little bit. We want to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. It's a good reminder as we have, it's going to be a full time over, whether it's at your job, at school, or whatever. Whenever you go out to buy something, buy groceries, whatever it might be, you're going to run into all of these things here during the next few weeks. So I hope this will help us to have first, a good biblical explanation if we should be called upon. We should be able to have in our mind or be reminded and familiar with that for not keeping Christmas, and also to give some practical wisdom in dealing with various Christmas situations.